Good evening and welcome. I'm Jed Levine. I'm the President Emeritus and Director of External Relations at CaringKind, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural presentation of CaringKind in the Know. Uh, we hope to review some what's trends and what's happening in treatment and testing, and we'll get into some other areas as well, as I hope. If anybody is new to CaringKind and it's your first contact with us, we are New York's trusted partner in dementia care and education, having been in existence for close to 50 years, actually, hard to believe. And I encourage you to take a look at our website at www.caringkindnyc.org or call our helpline at 646-744-2900 to get more information and find out about our extensive programs and services to help individuals living with Alzheimer's and related disorders and their family and other caregivers. These include programs of education like this, care consultation and navigation, individual support, trainings, support groups, early stage programming, cultural arts programming, cognitive stimulation therapy, and much, much more. And thanks to our donors and funders, all of our services are offered free of charge, and many of our programs are available in Spanish and Mandarin, as well as English. So just a couple of housekeeping comments. We are going to ask everybody to stay on mute, and then we will, if you have questions, put them in the chat, and staff will be monitoring the questions, and there will be time for us to respond to questions at the end of the program. November, this is the very beginning of November, and November is Alzheimer's Disease Awareness Month and National Caregivers Month. So this is a very timely program to mark those two events. It's also a very exciting time, especially for those of us like Dr. Honig and Dr. Sano and myself, who've been in the field for many years, because there's been it's a time of kind of rapidly, rapid developments in terms of testing and treatments. We now have 2 approved and available treatments for those in the earliest stages. It actually took us decades to get to this point, and we went for 18 years, I think it is, without any new approved treatment by the FDA. That's a very long time to wait. There are new ways of diagnosing Alzheimer's. There's mounting evidence of the effectiveness of lifestyle changes in keeping our brains healthy, and some promising trials in the works. I'd say this is just the beginning. There's a lot out there that I think is very hopeful and very promising. We hope to get some results fairly shortly, I understand. So our hope tonight is to give you some highlights and help you use this information well. It's an exciting time, but I think it's also a confusing time for consumers out there, for the public. What do these developments mean for those who are concerned about their own memory or have already been diagnosed, or for those who are supporting and caring for them? We are also living in, I would say, dangerously unprecedented times for academic and medical research. There's been a 40% reduction in funding for the NIH and NIA that's been proposed by the administration. 10% of the staff of the Center for Alzheimer's and Related Disorders unit has been let go at NIH. And I understand that some of the funding is flowing now, but it still feels like we're very much on shaky ground. There's no security about understanding what's going to come next. The federal government is now in shutdown, and with the number of layoffs and reduction in staff and concerning changes in the HHS leadership, I'm concerned that young researchers and research that's planned for like next year and the year going forward, our years coming forward, are very much in jeopardy. So I hope to be able to hear from our experts what the real impact is of the current environment on the present and future of Alzheimer's research in the United States. And let me welcome our guests. They are both two esteemed and highly respected experts in the field who have been doing this work, as I said, for decades. Mary Sano, PhD, is a professor of psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and director of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, the ADRC, and this year's recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Alzheimer's Association and the International Psychogeriatric Association Service Achievement Award. So welcome, Mary, and really honored to have you here with us. And Dr. Lawrence Honig, MD, PhD, is a professor of neurology at Columbia University Medical Center, and he directs the New York State Center of Excellence for Alzheimer's Disease and has, both have extensive experience in drug trials, in research, and hands-on experience with families facing the challenges of living with dementia and caring for someone with dementia. So thank you both for being here with us tonight, and let's get started. So I'd like to begin with one of the most covered stories in the media this summer about the Pointer study, which was new data was revealed in the Alzheimer's Disease International Conference this summer in Philadelphia. And what did we learn from it? So, Mary, if you could tell us a little bit about the Pointer study, what was it, and what are the take-home messages?
Sure. So the Pointer study was really designed to talk about brain health and prevention of cognitive deterioration, not necessarily a specific type of dementia or specific pathology. The study, built on the finger study, picked four areas in which they would encourage people to really beef up their game and improve their lifestyle. So these included physical exercise, it included diet and social interaction, as well as cognitive enhancement, staying cognitively stimulated. And one of the things that they did is they ran a group that had very intensive assistance in these four areas. And they had a comparison group that had a lower level in which they were informed about these kinds of activities, and they did them more at their own pace. And in fact, both of the groups showed an improvement on cognitive outcomes over time. But clearly, the intensive assisted group showed a benefit even above the group that was advised on its own. So it's really impressive to see an improvement in cognition. These are in adults, primarily 65 and older. And the real novel thing of this study was it was people who were at risk for Alzheimer's disease, who were at risk for dementia. The finger study, the original finger study, had really focused on people who had cardiovascular risk. Now, the one thing that I think is important to realize is there was a very big benefit. However, the benefit was in these groups of people who did none of those four areas. They were selected into the study if they really were deficient in all four of those areas. And so one question we have is, how much can we do if, in fact, we're already pretty active, socially interactive? Does beefing it up beyond that really make a difference? So I think it's really important for those total couch potatoes to realize there is some benefit that can be had, but I think we have to be careful to not assume that the same effect size would be seen for anyone who's already pretty active and pretty socially engaged. But it is good to understand that our lifestyle modifications can make a difference. But what are the limits of those differences? So we're very excited to be able to say it's worthwhile, but there is these limitations.
You mentioned that the study is really talking about kind of maintaining brain health.
Mhm.
Can you help us understand what's the difference between maintaining brain health and, quote, preventing, or I prefer the term, reducing risk for Alzheimer's or other related
Right.
disorders?
Right. Well, so we know the most about Alzheimer's disease, and I think there's
Hmm.
two things to keep in mind. There is a biology and there is a symptomatology, right? And while we all care about the symptoms, we would know that if you don't address underlying biology, you might get a simple symptomatic change, but we don't know how persistent it would be. So what I would say is that these studies suggest to us that lifestyle can sort of support our symptoms, support our brain health, our cognition. So it might take a little bit more pathology before you saw the symptoms, but we don't even know that for sure. And in
Hmm.
fact, one of the wonderful things about the study is there will be secondary analyses to look at individuals who do have amyloid, which is the really biology that underlies the first biology that underlies Alzheimer's disease. Or if in fact this benefit was seen in individuals who maybe didn't have the highest risk for Alzheimer's disease. So we really need to know who is it focused on. But I would argue that across all populations, the physical stimulation and the cognitive stimulation, healthier diets really could make a difference.
Hmm.
Not protecting against disease per se, but protecting against the display of the disease or the symptoms of the disease, or at least delaying their
Hmm.
visibility.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Um, So we do know that for people who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, that there are now available treatments. And as I said, this is really, in my perspective, really kind of revolutionary. We always had, not always, but for the past 20 or so years, or 30 years, we've had drugs that helped modify some of the symptoms for some people for some of the time. They were good, and I think we knew that people benefited from them. But now we have what are called disease-modifying drugs that are available. So there are two that are available: Kisunla and Leqembi. Larry or Dr. Honig, if you could tell us kind of what are these drugs, how are they administered, what are the benefits, what are the risks,
Sure.
and so forth.
So, I mean, I think all three of us here share your view that this is revolutionary, that we have drugs that actually modify the disease, unlike the symptomatic drugs that are on the market the last 30 years. So the last 2 years, 2.5 years, we've had two drugs, actually we had three at one point, now we have two,
Mhm.
that are FDA approved for slowing the progression of Alzheimer's disease. And there's despite a lot of controversy and naysaying over some of the earlier studies and some of the drugs that failed, there's really very few people who would deny that these drugs clearly have a benefit. I mean, much more so than, for example, the Pointer study in the cognitively normal people we were just talking about. Here we're talking about really significant changes of on the order of 26 to 37% for one of the drugs and 23% plus for the other drug. So basically, we're having significant slowing of disease over 18 months. There are a lot of unknowns. We don't know, for sure what happens after 18 months because we haven't done any placebo-controlled trials after 18 months of longer duration than 18 months. And there are a lot of other things we don't know about these drugs, including about the risks and who might be less favorable or who might be more favorable. But basically, we do know that in a large set of people who have a mild or early Alzheimer's disease, including mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease or
Mhm.
mild dementia due to Alzheimer's disease, that in these folks, there's a significant chance of significant benefit. And while there are criteria we use to decide who might be safely administered these drugs and who might be more efficacious or less. Basically, they clearly work. So what do they involve? They're a little bit more elaborate than oral medications that people may take concomitantly at the same time. These are intravenous drugs, although one of them, lecanemab or Leqembi, is now available in a subcutaneous auto-injector form, where you simply inject yourself once a week or have a partner or assistant inject you. That is only available at this point in time for people who've already completed 18 months of therapy, but it's under consideration for people even for initiation of therapy. But both drugs at the moment are being initiated with intravenous therapy, which means one has to go to an infusion center every 2 weeks, kind of like going to the hairdresser or the grocery store. Well, not as often as most people go to the grocery store. I think most people go often more often than every 2 weeks. But it is, unfortunately, there are infusion centers that are really widespread. So that doesn't seem to be a real barrier. It does require MRI monitoring, and that's, most people don't love MRIs. Some people do, but it does require 4 MRIs. Both drugs require 4 MRIs after the initiation of treatment for treatment monitoring, in addition to an MRI before the initiation of treatment. So we're talking 5 MRIs over 8 months or more, and that is also a little bit of an experience, but most people can tolerate an MRI. And the reason for that is
are the MRIs paid for by Medicare? And 'cause I know that.
Well, the first 6 months of approval for lecanemab, the first of the 2 really proven effective drugs, there was uncertainty about payment. But in July of 2023, which is already more than 2 years ago, the Center for Medicare Services Medicare agreed that this was a treatment that was safe and efficacious and should be paid for, as Medicare is supposed to do. So, true blue standard Medicare, which of course covers a lot of persons over the age of 65 in the United States, it covers these treatments without much ado. The private insurers, whether we're talking about the so-called Advantage, really the Medicare Part C plans that they've named in a cute way, calling them an advantage, but they're not an advantage in terms of access to care. They clearly are not. The whole idea of those plans is that they reduce access to care. The reason why they manage to give people gym benefits and things like that, and eye and dental and ophthalmological benefits, is by limiting the number of providers, the number of treatments, and the availability of medical treatments. So for these private plans, it's definitely been an issue that they're much more particular about who they might deem treatable.
You mentioned that there was that these drugs are effective. Can you describe the effect? What are the benefits?
Well, if one takes a look at people, and by a variety of measures, either looking at cognitive tests that Dr. Sato's been involved in many years of developing, or functional tests, namely how well people brush their teeth or watch TV or can put away the dishes or walk the dog or things like that, or even other effects, but certainly by both cognitive and functional measures and measures that combine both of those, there's efficacy. So in these studies of donanemab, which is Kisunla, and lecanemab, which is Leqembi, every single measure of function or cognition benefited. They benefit by different percentages slightly because they're different tests and they measure different things, and there's obviously variation, but it wasn't like there was any doubt at all, because across the board in these studies that had relatively very few people dropping out, there was across the board benefit in terms of people performing better over time if they were treated with drug than if they were treated with placebo. So they were all getting infusions every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, but the people who were getting the real thing, the drug, did better than the people who were getting the placebo or saline salt solution. So it really was dramatic that there was this really clear effect. It was clear at every time point measured. It was clear in every measure that we did, cognitive or functional or combined. And it was clear also in what we call biomarkers, which we may talk about later on.
Mhm.
We have various blood-based and spinal fluid-based biomarkers, and of course, PET scan biomarkers, various ways of looking at how bad or how less bad, to be cute,
Mhm.
the Alzheimer's is. And by each of those measures, almost every biomarker, not everyone, but almost everyone, every biomarker improved on people treated with drugs. So they looked like they had less Alzheimer's, if you will.
Boy. Uh, that- but I think as with any drug, we have to talk about the benefits and the risks. And Dr. Sano, Mary, if you could talk a little bit about kind of what are the risks and how should
Well,
people approach
right, and I think Larry would probably agree. It's not just the benefits and the risks, it's picking the right population.
mm,
So obviously, this is a drug that is targeting amyloid, which is the first biomarker of Alzheimer's disease, right? So it's right for people who have amyloid, right?
mhm,
That's number one. And number two is it's at this very mild stage. So that's really important because we do know that there are some side effects. There's a small portion of people who have brain changes that we refer to as ARIA, which really refers to imaging changes that measure what might be called uh, strokes, but
mm,
many of them are asymptomatic, and but we do need to monitor them, right? So that's a very important issue. And the fact that it works in this way also means that individuals who have other medical conditions, maybe that require um, anticoagulation, they may not be the best candidates for this,
mhm,
although, in fact, there's not necessarily a requirement that they can't take them. And I think one of the things that's really wonderful about this is we're taking people in the earliest stages where they can help make the decision about whether or not they want the risk benefit. We know with any medical condition, some people choose to be treated for it and others don't. But I think we have to respect the fact that when people say, I notice, I mean, in our early stage patients, they, not just their family members, but they come to us and say, something's not right and I want to do something about it. And I think that you talk about in the know and where we're going. I think that's changing. I think people are becoming aware that they're starting to have problems and will look earlier to see what is present.
mhm,
So I think that there are risks. The risks include, a reaction to at the site of the infusion or injection, or these ARIA risks, but they've ended up being a lot more manageable than we ever expected when we did our trials. And
mhm,
I think that really speaks to the fact that um, our community of physicians are learning how to pick the right people for this. I think people are coming in earlier, asking what's right. So I'm not minimizing the risks. And we know, for example, that individuals who have a specific genotype of the apolipoprotein 4 allele, the ones who have the 4, are more likely to have some of these problems, and people who have 2 4s are even more likely. But everything that you have, every medical condition has a risk in its treatment. And
mhm,
I think what's really great is we're getting to a point where we can share with people what the risk benefit is and let them help us decide, is this worth going?
mhm. Great, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. And I think, and it's certainly my understanding that the number of people who actually have ARIA is quite small. Um, and now that we have
Especially symptomatic ARIA.
right, exactly. Most they can have it but without any symptoms, and it kind of resolves on its own. Um, but so thank you. Um, so one of the ways that we are people have to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And one of the things that we are looking at and have been hoping for is a way of detecting it without having to do a spinal tap to see if there's although I understand spinal taps are not as frightening and uncomfortable as they used to be. I think they still have a bit of a stigma about them. But doing something through a simple blood test. And Larry, I think we're there. We actually have blood tests. Can you tell us what is the state of the art with the FDA-approved blood tests?
Right. Well, there's been, blood tests being developed over time to try to better diagnose Alzheimer's disease on larger scale. The biggest limitation of spinal fluid testing is that it requires a neurologist or a trained practitioner to go and take out the spinal fluid. And it's a lot easier to take out blood. The training involved in that is much lower, and everyone's familiar with getting blood tests. So that's the big advantage of blood tests, is that it's not that it's that much faster than spinal fluid, but it requires less expertise. So, it's been a big advance to have now two blood tests that are on the market that are FDA approved for being close to about as good as our established biomarkers, namely PET scans or spinal fluid testing. And, they're not perfect, they're in the 90% range, depending how you look at it, as high as 97% in terms of, or as low as 92%, and some of them even lower, depending exactly how you look at it. So they're not perfect, but a really normal test on the blood-based biomarker is often quite reassuring that a person is not having the beginnings of Alzheimer's disease. Of course, the beginnings is a vague thing, but established Alzheimer's disease really in a large number of people, in the high 90s, shows up in the blood. So that's good. The other direction isn't as clear. There are people who have positive tests who may not have positive indicators of Alzheimer's disease by PET scans or spinal fluid testing. So overall, the tests are, definitely something that is potentially useful, particularly in people who you don't really think have Alzheimer's disease, to reassure them that they don't. I don't think too many people would engage in, too many patients or practitioners are willing to engage in years worth of treatments every 2 weeks or 4 weeks intravenously simply on the basis of these blood tests right now.
Mm-hmm.
There are some cases where what we call the presentation, the clinical symptoms and the course are so typical of Alzheimer's disease, and then the biomarkers are also so typical of Alzheimer's disease, that it's reasonable to say that the overwhelming odds are that this is Alzheimer's disease, and that one does not need to proceed to more specialized testing, such as PET scanning or spinal fluid testing. However, I think in general, we're thinking of these blood tests as a way of triaging, if one will, or trying to go and relieve some people of the burden of thinking they might have Alzheimer's disease, and correspondingly or conversely indicating to practitioners and patients that they may well have the beginnings of Alzheimer's disease. Mm-hmm. So they're useful tests, the two that are licensed and many others that are out there that are not licensed, but that are still being performed in these states other than New York State. New York State has special rules, but these tests are much, much better than we ever expected 10 years ago, but are not quite as good as the established biomarkers.
Mm-hmm. And do the tests, go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, so I think, Larry has just really told you about some of the most important things, but what we won't know about is, until these tests are sort of more broadly available, what happens when they're used by the practitioner who doesn't have the skill of someone like Larry to evaluate the cognitive complaint or the behavioral complaint. And that's where we're really we really need to have more precision with those tests so that, in fact, if someone has symptoms, right, we need to find out why they have symptoms, even if the amyloid is absent. So that's important. On the other hand, as Larry said, is if these individuals have symptoms and we have a positive test, that's great. I think where we're really going to have a big challenge is when we have the test, but we don't have good skill in describing the symptoms or knowing what the profile of a person's cognitive complaint or cognitive problem is. That's going to be the real challenge, I think.
I think that's right. I mean, I certainly left out a number of things and very appropriately touched on them. I mean, one issue is, well, if somebody has symptoms and they have a negative Alzheimer's test in the blood, I said that it's pretty likely they don't have Alzheimer's. That's true. But as Mary pointed out, they still have something.
Right.
And
What do
that's
they have?
when, of course, we have to do more specialized testing, such as spinal fluid testing or other testing. So that is really a key. I think the other thing that Mary importantly touched upon was the issue of testing people who are not symptomatic, and their bets are sort of off as to what the meaning of having positive Alzheimer's biomarkers that are indicative of the beginnings of Alzheimer's in somebody who has no symptoms at all. And so that is an issue. It's kind of like the controversies that have surrounded the widespread use of the prostate-specific antigen, PSAG test, where a lot of people have abnormal PSAG tests or mammograms. A lot of people have gone through many, many, many breast mammograms and breast ultrasounds and biopsies and invasive procedures because our biomarkers aren't so perfect for breast cancer. So, of course, and that period is, of course, a very scary period, thinking that you might die of breast cancer. And likewise, the same thing is true for the Alzheimer's blood tests, where with their wide use, there are going to be a lot of people who are sitting there with a result in front of them that says, quote, they have a high likelihood of having Alzheimer's disease. And specialists such as at centers such as Dr. Sano's and my own, we see a lot of such people who come in saying, look, I have these blood tests, what do they mean? And the primary practitioner is sending them because I ordered this blood test, because the patient asked me to, and now I don't know what it means, what to do with it.
So if it's not Alzheimer's, and they don't have the amyloid or tau, are there blood tests for dementias other than Alzheimer's? Are there other biomarker tests for like Lewy body or FTD or other related disorders?
Well, with the exception of the genetic disorders, where if there's a strong family history, it's possible there's a genetic form of one of these disorders, and a genetic test might be definitive in the setting of symptoms. But with the exception of that, there aren't blood tests for any of the other dementia disorders, any of the degenerative dementia disorders anyway. So particularly the second most common degenerative dementia, which is Lewy body disease. This is under development. There's a wide variety of investigators around the world and companies that are trying very hard to develop blood-based biomarkers for Lewy body disease. And we have tests that can sort of give some rough indication about whether there's anything going on in the brain. The NFL test, which is very non-specific, but may go up in a variety of brain or spinal cord degenerations. But we don't have any specific blood tests for specific degenerations of the brain, except the ones for Alzheimer's disease. And so that is an issue.
And this is where clinical expertise comes into play, right? Because, a really knowledgeable neurologist who works in this area can make very good distinctions between the overall clinical profile, being careful to assess movement, being careful to assess the behavioral symptoms. Are we really looking at someone who doesn't exactly have a memory deficit, but has another kind of a cognitive deficit? And I think for now, we really have to acknowledge that expertise is never going to go away. It's really going to be important until we have more help to decide which of these other conditions might be present. And then I think that, there's a wide range of other phenomena that can affect our cognition, right? They're not virulently progressive the way the diseases we've just spoken of are, but the impact on vascular disease and metabolic conditions can affect our cognition. And behavioral and psychiatric background and history can also affect our cognition. And
Mhm.
so the need, when you actually have symptoms, bothersome symptoms, to be sure that it's evaluated phenomenologically or clinically as well as biologically, can be really important.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would echo that. That of course, while we were talking about symptoms, as Mary clearly correctly enunciated, not all symptoms are due to degenerative brain disease.
That's right.
People can
Right.
be under the influence of toxic substances. People can have psychiatric disorders that are poorly understood, but depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, and a whole bunch
Medical
of, of,
condition.
of
Yeah.
conditions, as well as medical conditions such as kidney failure or liver failure or heart failure. Many of these other conditions can affect cognition and behavior, and they may not be degenerative. Uh, Sometimes it's obvious that one of these conditions is likely to be the cause, but
Mhm.
sometimes it's exceedingly non-obvious. And
Mhm.
as Mary points out, that's why it's important to go to a center where there's expertise or a
Mhm.
practitioner with expertise to try to make certain that an appropriate diagnosis is made.
Right. Just want to make a point that, and I don't know what it's like at both of your centers, but I understand from folks that I've spoken to that getting an appointment at one of the major diagnostic centers can be anywhere from 6 to 9 or 10 or more months. Um, that there's a greater demand than there is a supply of knowledgeable neurologists in the dementia field. And I think that that's an issue that we all need to address and work on.
Yeah,
Um,
that's certainly the case. And I think one of the things that you'll be seeing, I think driven a little bit by the fact that we now have treatments,
mhm.
I think you'll be seeing real efforts to train a wider range of professionals to do at least the basic kinds of workup. I think the very detailed behavioral workup can be tough for a primary care doctor to do,
Mhm.
but he can know a neuropsychologist in his community who might be able to give him some background on what the cognitive profile is. Uh, there's a way to develop for them sort of more precise questions that can give them a hint as to exactly what the problem is. And now that we know that it's worth doing that, because in some areas we have treatments, I think there'll be a higher motivation for a wider range of practitioners to develop expertise in this.
Yeah, that would be great.
And I was going to make a similar comment
Mhm.
that uh, while we all agree that busy primary care practitioners don't have the wherewithal in terms of often knowledge or ability in terms of their timing and their resources to uh, to do the sort of evaluations we're talking about, most centers now are using highly trained nurse practitioners and physician's assistants who may not be experts at heart disease or kidney disease, but may be extremely expert, much more than any than the vast majority of primary care practitioners, or for that matter, heart doctors,
Mhm.
at evaluating these sort of cognitive or behavioral symptoms. So nurse
Mhm.
practitioners and physician's assistants, I think, will increasingly be available to help what you mentioned, which is some limitation in the number of neurologists, psychiatrists, and geriatric practitioners
Mhm.
that are available. So, as well as the role of neuropsychologists that Dr. Sano pointed out.
We have a question that actually points to something that I wanted to discuss with you. One is about the issue of young onset Alzheimer's, not early stage, but young onset. And is this primarily a cause caused by genetics? I think probably not always, but if you can comment on that. And then also to share if you've If we've gotten any information on the EVOKE or EVOKE Plus trials and whether GLP-1 drugs, the weight loss drugs and the diabetes drugs will have a positive effect on slowing down the disease, or perhaps even maybe delaying the onset of symptoms.
Maybe I'll
So
start with
whoever
the
wants to
first and let
take that,
Mary
yes.
the second.
Okay.
So in terms of early onset Alzheimer's disease, which is defined as people with an onset of symptoms earlier than age 60 or 65, and this is much more common than we might have realized 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. People are more sensitive to small changes in cognition and behavior, and and there are a lot of individuals, a very significant fraction of the patients with degenerative dementia do present under the age of 65 or under the age of 60, and sometimes under the age of 50. So the question, of course, came up, how often are these genetic? And the answer is, even in these early onset cases, while the possibility of what we call an autosomal dominant, strictly speaking, inherited disorder is higher in people who have onset in their 50s, for example, it is still not the majority. So the majority of people with Alzheimer's disease at age 55 or 50 or 60 do not have a genetic cause. That we know of anyway, do not have an inherited genetic cause that could be passed down 50-50 to their children, or was given to them by one of their parents. That is not the majority of cases, but it is a more substantial minority than it is in people who get Alzheimer's disease manifest in their 70s or 80s. So, so it behooves practitioners to always think about the possibility of a genetic cause, and families are often interested. It has implications for subsequent generations. So it's a important thing for us to not neglect the fact that a small proportion of people with Alzheimer's disease in the country do have a genetic cause.
Okay, thank you.
In terms of the EVOKE and EVOKE Plus trials, I think the big news for these drugs will be coming out right around Thanksgiving, with the data being presented at a meeting called CTAD, Clinical Trials in Alzheimer's Disease. Now, this is going to be a very interesting result or study, because in fact, this study required that individuals have amyloid to get into the trial, because they wanted to specifically say it helps Alzheimer's disease. So amyloid and Alzheimer's disease are highly connected. The problem is that the strongest evidence for a benefit from these drugs, in my mind, really comes from some clinical trials in which it was showing a cognitive benefit in people who had diabetes or metabolic syndromes. And the benefit was really seen in tests of executive function. And in early cases of Alzheimer's disease, the deficits are more likely to be in memory. And if you take a very mildly impaired person who has amyloid, the likelihood that they also have a metabolic condition and still have these great scores is kind of low. So there is a possibility that the trials will have missed the critical population that they wanted to collect, which would be Alzheimer's plus some of these metabolic or diabetic kinds of conditions. However, it is possible, maybe it does transfer to this population. We do know that an amyloid positive population does get worse over time, right? People who have symptoms and cognitive deficits and have amyloid, we can predict very well how likely they are to decline as a group. And so we're studying this in the right population for seeing a change, right? But we don't know biologically whether or not this mechanism is going to be successful. It's very exciting to hear the results. They've did a good job designing the trials. The sample size are quite large, so even a small benefit, if it's there, should be visible. But there is a possibility that this is not a mechanism that can help in the presence of such a clear case of Alzheimer's disease without other influences. So it's an important question. I think the other question, though, is if in fact we do see a benefit, will the requirement be similar to use these drugs only in people who have Alzheimer's disease, meaning have amyloid, since that's the way the trials were run? Now, these drugs are a lot less expensive than the amyloid agents are, the anti-amyloid agents are. So conceivably,
Not sure about that, Mary.
well,
About the same, I think.
well,
Almost the same.
I don't think they're quite the same. I mean, maybe the cost to the patient would be the same,
I
but
think so. Just about the same right now. I mean, roughly.
so this would become a question of how they would be used. So, but
Yeah.
I think it's exciting that, this is one of the things that I think is exciting, but a challenge, right? So we all say, oh, that more than half of the agents are not amyloid agents. But unfortunately, most of them are only tested in amyloid positive individuals. And that's a problem because, as the uh, IDEAS study told us, when experienced physicians recommend somebody for an amyloid imaging, they're right about 60% of the time that person does have amyloid, but about 40% of the time they don't. So there are people who have conditions that we don't really know their underlying etiology. And right now, they're not necessarily included in a lot of the clinical trials that are looking at non-amyloid mechanisms. And there are reasons for that. There are some efficiencies, but there's also some limitations on what we can learn.
I want to move to another
Maybe I would
topic.
just put it
Oh, go
a little
ahead.
bit more a different way. I think Mary said it very nicely, but I guess I would turn it a little bit more and look at mechanism as the primary thing, which I think is, I'm saying sort of the same thing that Mary was saying. But the fact is, one can ask two things about these drugs. One is whether they affect Alzheimer's, and one is whether they affect more broadly something else that is influencing cognition. So we should have the answer to some extent with these two trials, because we'll be able to see, one, whether people did better with the drugs, and two, whether these drugs influence the biomarkers, suggesting that the way people did better, if they do better, was based on an Alzheimer's action. Sort of the same thing is going to come up with the Pointer study, that if we circle back to the beginning, where, okay, people did a tiny little bit better with the more intense intervention, but we have no idea if that has anything to do with Alzheimer's or simply something else. And there it's more, most people believe it's probably something else. But again, we will have data because there's a PET scan sub-study of Pointer, to circle back to that should tell us exactly whether this 2 years worth of intense Mediterranean diet and exercise and cognitive and cardiovascular attention resulted in any change in Alzheimer's biomarkers. So the power of biomarkers, to circle back to that and complete the loop, is not only diagnosis, but also monitoring and being able to go and ask, what are our therapies doing? So it's, while we all find these tests important, including people in Washington who talk about these tests, that we know that these tests of our abilities aren't as good as we might like. And that's why biomarkers, something that tells us biologically, like seeing a tumor on an X-ray, can be very valuable in assessing your therapies and what exactly they are doing.
Right. Whether they actually reduce the amyloid and they're actually use that biological effect.
I actually don't think that the GLP-1s expect to move the amyloid. They expect to see a cognitive benefit, and they're looking at many other biomarkers, including NFL, as you mentioned, which is sort of a broad one, but I don't really think they actually are expecting to see a change in the amyloid biomarkers.
Yeah, well, they may not, but they have argued that
Yeah.
that there is a mechanism that could possibly cause some such effect. But I think many of us may not expect it, but I think they're hopeful.
It remains to be seen, I think.
Yes, yes.
We shall see. I did want to, before we close, I know that there's been a lot of discussion. I've gotten a lot of questions personally just about the issue of, the study of lithium in animal models, that there is a correlation between lithium in the brain and the development of Alzheimer's. Your thoughts on this study, and are you being asked about this as well?
Larry, do you want to begin?
Sure. I mean, anytime there's a new report in a scientific journal, such as this report in Nature by some prominent researchers at Harvard, uh, anytime there's a report on anything, the news media brings it up and patients bring it up. And when the proposal or the substance of the report is that possibly a relatively benign health food substance, a health food store substance, or a supplement might be valuable in treating disease, people's eyes open up even more and they ask you about it. So, so certainly, certainly for the first few weeks after that report, just about everyone in my office was asking about lithium, regardless of what condition they had and anything else. This study was principally a mouse study. They did try to see whether there was changes in lithium measured levels in the brain. We know that's very, very deceptive, and there have been many wrong turns we've made in the past looking at brain tissue for minerals. Looking at brain tissue for amyloids, very good, but looking for minerals turns out to be not so good. Lithium is a mineral. So the idea that treating with extremely low dose lithium, this health food marketed substance called lithium orotate, as opposed to the lithium carbonate at much higher levels that we use in psychiatric disorders, might be possibly beneficial in Alzheimer's disease, has been very tantalizing, but there's really no evidence in humans in support of it, and some evidence, like Mary mentioned, I guess it was before we all joined up, but some evidence that from small trials that it's not beneficial. I think we're all a bit dubious that lithium, a mineral, is going to affect amyloid and tau and the degeneration of Alzheimer's disease.
Okay. Good. Mary, any thoughts on that, or?
No, I think, there are two things about this phenomenon of hearing about something, as Larry mentions, when we hear about something and we can turn it into a treatment. One is, I think it is good for people to be aware of what the science is. As follow the science is really a good advice. Especially for so many people who may not have a clear dimension or looking to find out, what do we know about new things. But I would also say you have to listen with a grain of salt. And animal studies can be really informative, but they are far from definitive. And I think that's what you have to keep in mind.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Absolutely. I did want to mention, or just to hear from you very briefly about kind of what the current state or the effect of the current administration, cutbacks in funding, the uncertainty I think that everybody is feeling about what's happening in the world of medical research, and specifically around Alzheimer's disease. So if you could just briefly mention kind of what are you experiencing at your centers? Are trials continuing? Can people recruit? Can people register for new trials? And how do they do that?
You want to begin, or should I?
Sure, I can begin. I mean, most trials of drugs are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies, so the federal funding hasn't directly affected that. However, I think we all know that a high tide, floats all boats, and there's no question that having fewer staff and fewer projects going on and fewer resources does affect our ability to go and carry out all the activities that we carry out. For observational trials that are also very important, such as the Alzheimer's disease neuroimaging project and other projects, FTD projects, Lewy body projects, a whole host of observational, the early onset Alzheimer's disease projects, a whole host of projects that are multi-center and involved, and just as involved in some ways as drug studies, but are research to help us understand, for example, new biomarkers, which you mentioned earlier, to help us understand disease progression and help us understand treatment monitoring. So these sort of studies are generally federally funded, not drug company funded, and are vital to our understanding and have been vital to the development of the therapies that we have right now, lecanemab and donanemab. So, and they have been impacted by the funding uncertainties and funding cuts and a decrease in overhead or indirect costs. So in a variety of ways, the cuts in funding and the uncertainties about funding have impacted the rather dramatic progression of knowledge and about these disorders, and the curve that we've been going on, which has been really rather nicely upwards, and
Yes.
this has put a little dent in our ability to make progress.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think
Mary?
in particular, the newer projects are really the ones that are suffering, and the youngest of our researchers are the ones who are suffering. So even though our center grant came in, it did not come in until June. And so people who were supposed to be fellows, students who are working in the area who should have been hired in February, don't get a chance to come in until October. And so that's a loss of a very big educational opportunity and a research opportunity. And now, because it's unclear what the government is going to do, when they finally do get their funding, they have to spend it quickly so that the government will say, well, you didn't spend it, we want to take it back. Now, we don't know. Maybe the government won't say that at all, but we just don't know. And that's the uncertainty that really impacts the next generation and impacts new initial science, right? And that, I think, is one of the places that I'm most concerned. We've seen that most of our trials that were in place, our patients were safe, the trials get to go forward. But even, many of the projects that I work on are public-private partnerships. And the willingness to establish a public-private partnership when you don't know if public's going to deliver, it's really starting to be felt. And so finding your corporate or commercial sponsors to partner with you is really, it's been slowed down. And, we had this momentum. So I think it's really important that we don't lose it. And I'm really hopeful that we'll see at least an end to the shutdown so that we can really have a good communication with our NIH colleagues. It's my experience is, as a researcher, it's a really integrated experience. They come and ask all of us, what's the next science we need to do? And when they get the answer, they then go out to people and say, okay, this is what we need from you. And I just think not having that going on is really going to stymie the next few years of
I
research.
think it's going to slow down a lot of, potential progress in the future. Well, I want to thank you both for being the first guests on CaringKind in the Know. We are honored that you bring your experience, and I think what's evident is your deep commitment and to finding better treatments and the integrity of research and science to this program. So thank you so much. And I want to also just mention to the participants that you will be getting a brief program evaluation form, so please fill that out and send it back to us. And if we use that information to, do this continuous improvement of these kinds of sessions, let us know if there's anything in particular you would like us to talk about in our next CaringKind in the Know. And I also want to mention to you that we are holding our first annual Dementia Education Conference on March 30th of 2026, the next year, at the New York Academy of Medicine. And the theme is connecting care, science, and community. We didn't get to talk today at all about care, and I know that's important. I did also wanted to talk about some of the behavioral issues that families face and ways that they can, address those. So please join us next time for the next Caring Kind in the Know. You can find out more about the conference by looking at ckconference.org. That's ckconference.org. Registration will open in January. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Honig. Thank you, Dr. Sano, and thank you all for participating. And we'll see you next time.
Great. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.